today, you'll be very happy to hear we're going to actually get out of hell. So we're just looking at the very last cantos, and we just finished talking about Ugolino and Ruggieri. I don't think I talked about this part of the PowerPoint yet. Just a kind of general comment about the Ugolino-Ruggieri scene. It's, if not the most horrifying, one of the most horrifying scenes in the Inferno. Dante shows how human beings can transcend the human in Paradiso. He even coins a term in Italian, trashumanar, means going beyond the human, to attain an almost angelic goodness. But in the Ugolino episode, at the end of the Inferno, he shows how low humanity can sink to the level of animals, or even worse than animals, starving one another, in the case of Ruggieri, feeding off the flesh of their own species, in the case of Ugolino, taking his revenge. It reminds me of the nadir of pessimism in Shakespeare's King Lear, when Albany says to Goneril, after the blinding of Gloucester, remember the most horrifying scene in King Lear, if that the heavens do not their visible spirits send down quickly to tame these vile offenses, it will come, humanity must perforce prey on itself like monsters of the deep. So in the Ugolino episode, then, the description of the souls in hell has come full circle. Near the beginning of the Inferno, Francesca and Paolo are joined in their suffering by love. And near the end of the canticle, Ugolino and Ruggieri are joined, but this time not by love, but by hate. I don't know whether I did this or not. If you look at the entire Inferno, there are three scenes which stand out, not only for their length, but also for their exceptional dramatic intensity. Paolo and Francesca, Ulysses and Diomedes, Ugolino and Ruggieri. You can kind of see a progression there. Paolo and Francesca are united by their love. Ulysses and Diomedes don't really seem to have any interest in each other. And Ugolino and Ruggieri are united by hatred. In each of these scenes, there's a pair of souls that come together, one of whom speaks, one of whom is silent. Each of them elicits a strong sympathy from Dante and from the reader. Ugolino himself doesn't elicit any sympathy from Dante, but his sons do, and his grandchildren, right? And the scenes occur in cantos numbered 5, 26, and 33. Or if you consider only the books of the Inferno, 4, 25, and 32. Remember the first, why do I say books? Cantos, excuse me, that's a mistake. Considering only the cantos of the Inferno, 4, 25, and 32. Remember, the first canto of the Inferno is a kind of introduction to the whole poem. And then there are 33 additional cantos, just like 33 in Purgatorio, 33 in Paradiso. So it's a mathematical puzzle. What's the key to this numerical sequence? 5, 26, 33, or 4, 25, 32. Now, I've been asking this for a number of years, and I knew eventually some Chinese student who was talented in mathematics would give me the answer. And in fact, in 2008, there was a student who came up, and she pointed out, because I had shown them my article on number symbolism in the Divine Comedy, in which I think 64 is a very important number because it's the cube of 4. And she said, well, 5 plus 26 plus 33 equals 64. I don't know exactly, I don't know exactly what to do with this, but I know 64 is a very important number. because it's the number of everything. 4 are the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water of the natural world. And of course 3 is the number of the Trinity. So 4 and 3, 4 raised to the 3rd power has got to be a significant number. Now, whether Dante, is this just coincidence, or did Dante have something in mind? But it is, it certainly does appear to you as you're reading that these 3 pairs of characters stand out as something unusual. And if you just talk about, what are the best known episodes? Well, certainly Francesca and Paolo, Ulysses and Diomedes, and Ugolino and Ruggieri in terms of influence on later writers, and just stick in the memory of readers. There's a theological puzzle, and I think maybe did we talk about this already, Frau Berigo? I was having a little trouble remembering just how far we got. But you remember Frau Berigo is a character in Canto 33, who Dante says, because he was a traitor to his guests, his soul is already being punished in hell, and his body is still alive on earth. I talked about this. What's the explanation for that? It's a contradiction of a central medieval teaching of the church that it's never too late to repent. So to damn a soul to hell before the body has died is a serious violation of church doctrine. And what I'm wondering is, why Dante has made this kind of strange, or has included this kind of strange idea in his poem. And the only thing I've been able to come up with is that Dante was in exile. Therefore, he was dependent upon the hospitality of other people, and was therefore perhaps particularly concerned about the host-guest relationship. But that doesn't seem to me to be a very adequate explanation. So anyone wants to give me an answer to that, you'll be put in the PowerPoint for next year. Now we get to Dante's Satan. So let's look at that, the final canto. Vexilla regis prodeunt inferni. So a rather strange opening to the canto, a Latin quotation. The banners of the infernal king come forth. This opening to the canto sets a tone which is going to be carried throughout, and that is a tone of parody or sarcasm. Because this, except for the inferni part, except for the infernal part, the banners of the king come forth, is the first line of a famous Easter hymn that was written in the 6th century by Venantius Fortunatus. And it's a hymn that's sung when the cross, the altar cross at the front of the church, on Good Friday, the day that Christ was thought to have died, that is the Friday before Easter, the cross is taken down from the altar and put in a box. And the box is called the sepulchre. So it's sort of miming or imitating the death of Christ. The cross is taken from the front of the church, put in a box, the box is put away, and then on Easter Sunday morning, the cross is taken out and a procession comes down the main aisle of the church and puts the cross back on the altar. And the idea is this is a representation of the resurrection, representation of Christ coming back to life. And so as the procession comes down the altar, this hymn comes down the aisle of the church towards the altar, this hymn is sung. So Vexilla regis prodeunt inferni, towards us. It's sort of odd how Virgil just melds the Latin right into the vernacular language. Of course, it's a little less jolting in Italian, because Italian is much closer to Latin than English. And therefore keep your eyes ahead, my master said, to see if you can spy him. Well, again, I think it would make a very interesting study to analyze these cantos from the point of view of a naive reader, because we don't know who the pronoun him refers to, right, at this point. Unless you've read the argument, you have no idea what's happening here. So him, who? Just as, so there's a suspense created, which is totally lost if you read ninth traitor, fourth ring called Judecca, where the traitors against the benefactors are fully covered by ice. Dis, or Lucifer, emperor of that kingdom, and so forth, then you know who it is. So just as when night falls on our hemisphere, or when a heavy fog is blowing thick, a windmill seems to wheel when seen far off, so then I seem to see that sort of structure. So notice how Shakespeare, where did I get that? Oh, sorry, Shakespeare. Notice how Satan is, I don't know, because I was talking about Shakespeare. I'm an old man, cut me some slack, right? So just as Dante sees Satan, it seems to him to be some kind of mechanical structure. And this is the whole key to understand Dante's presentation of Satan. He's not presented as a living creature. He's presented as a kind of machine. So as we'll see, totally different than the way Milton presents Satan in his great poem as a eloquent and glorious creature, right? A fallen angel, but still an angel. Dante's Satan is ugly and stupid and mute. And next, because the wind was strong, that's another bit of suspense that, Dante has put into his poem, that there's this wind, and, where does it come from? And Dante asks Virgil, he says, all heat is lost in this place. So how can there be a difference of heat and cold to create wind? And Virgil says, wait, you'll see where the wind comes from. So again, a kind of suspense that causes the reader to want to read on to get a solution to this question. Where is the wind coming from? So, and next, because the wind was strong, I shrank behind my guide. There was no other shelter. So you've got to imagine the scene here at the bottom of Hell Cocytus. Absolutely no obstacles of any kind, right? Because the sinners are frozen into the ice. It's just a big sheet of ice, and then there's Satan, and then there's the cliff that they've been put down, where Antaeus set them into the lowest part of hell. So there's no shelter of any kind. And so he simply has to shelter behind Virgil to give him a break from the wind. And now with fear I set it down in meter. I was where the shades, that is the souls, were fully covered, but visible as wisps of straw in glass. There some lie flat and others stand erect, one on his head and one upon his soles, and some bend face to feet, just like a bow. So a ghastly situation. The ultimate sin in Dante's scheme is betrayal of a benefactor. Someone who wants to do good to you, and you use the relationship of trust between the benefactor and yourself to somehow cheat or harm the benefactor. And so these souls do not appear above the ice at all. Dante just sees them frozen into the depth of the ice, like straws in glass. Now, I don't know why straw used to be used in the making of glass, but if you see a very old piece of straw, a very old piece of glass, sometimes there are fragments of straw that actually got into the glass when the glass was being melted. So this is what Dante is referring to. But after we had made our way ahead, my master felt that he should now have me see that creature who was once a handsome presence. He stepped aside and made me stop and said, "Lo, look, here is Dis, and this is the place where you will have to arm yourself with fortitude." So it's quite a dramatic build-up to the actual confrontation with the ultimate source of all the evil in the world. So Virgil steps aside and he identifies what he calls Dis. Virgil, remember, is a pagan. He doesn't know the terms Satan or Beelzebub or Lucifer. Those are all Christian and Judaic terms. So he uses dis, which was the one of the words for the king of hell in classical mythology. Look, here is dis, and this is the place where you will have to arm yourself with fortitude. So Dante now faces the acid test of his journey through hell, that is, facing Satan himself. The other thing to notice in that passage is the idea of the creature who was once. The Italian tense is called past perfect tense, ebbe. It means past, but really past. You almost like a has-been. You know how in the English idiom you can say that guy is a has-been. Nicolas Sarkozy, thank God, is now a has-been, right? It means somebody who was somebody important, but now he's a has-been important. In the past was important, right? So was once is a good translation. He was once a handsome presence. Lucifer, the idea of Lucifer, the name Lucifer means light bearer. And according to Christian mythology, he was the most glorious of the angels, right? And that's why he thought he could usurp God's power. O reader, do not ask of me how I grew faint and frozen then. I cannot write it. All words would fall far short of what it was. So we notice that Dante makes a direct address to the reader only in situations of particular dramatic intensity. And here he asks the reader to sympathize with his fear in confronting Satan himself. I did not die, and I was not alive. Think for yourself, if you have any wit, what I became, deprived of life and death. The emperor of the despondent kingdom so towered from the ice, up from mid-chest, that I match better with a giant's breadth than giants match the measure of his arms. Now you can gauge the size of all of him. Well, I think Mandelbaum must have been getting quite tired when he translated this part of the poem, because there's no reason to translate that breadth. There's nothing about breadth, it's the height. The Italian says that I in size am closer to a giant, e più con gigante, io mi convegno. So you can work it out, and of course I've worked it out. 6 is to 70. You figure Dante's about 6 feet tall. It might be a little less. People in the Middle Ages were not very tall. 6 is to 70, as 70 is to x. X is 817. So that's the size of Satan's arm, but then the arm is, the body is 2.5 times the length of the arm, so you multiply that by 2.5 and you get about 2,000 feet. So it's more like a building. You have to kind of imagine Satan as looking more like a building than a living creature, and that's why Dante, when he first sees him, thinks it's a windmill. If he was once as handsome as he is ugly now, and despite that raised his brows against his Maker, one can understand how every sorrow has its source in him. So, just the point I made, he was once the most beautiful of all the angels, and despite that raised his brows means, decided to rebel against, decided to show disdain for his Maker, God, then one can understand how every sorrow has its source in him. Remember, there was no sin in the world until Satan tempted Eve. So he's the source of all sin. I marveled that when I saw on his head he had 3 faces. Now this gets pretty hard to imagine. But what Dante is doing here is showing us Satan as a parody of the Christian Trinity. He's like God, but the exact opposite. So there's enough similarities to make a kind of comparison, but the comparison only serves to highlight the oppositions between Satan and God. So he had three faces, one in front, blood red. So the color of the three faces is something that the commentators have argued about. My own view is it represents the three main races of human beings on the earth. Blood red is Caucasian. Look at my face. People like to say, Caucasians are white. We're not white, we're red. And then another two just above the midpoint of each shoulder joined the first. And at the crown, all three were reattached. It's hard to imagine. There are illustrations that try to show this. It's grotesque. The right looks somewhat yellow, somewhat white. Those are the Asian. And the left in its appearance was like those who come from where the Nile descending flows. So that's Africa, the black peoples. Underneath each, so the colors of the faces in this interpretation represent Satan's dominion over the earth. No race of human beings is immune from the temptation of evil. Beneath each face of his, two wings spread out, as broad as suited so immense a bird. So he has wings. Those are his angel wings, right? He's retained his wings. But they're not feathered wings. They're not like an angel's wings. They're like a bat's wings. So immense a bird, there's got to be some derisiveness in that, some mocking of Satan, calling him a big bird. I've never seen a ship with sails so wide. They had no feathers, but were fashioned like a bat's, and he was agitating them, so that three winds made their way out from him, and all Cocytus froze before those winds. So the bat, as I've learned in Chinese lore, is a positive animal, but in Western not, associated with darkness and evil and vampire bats and all kinds of bad things. Not lucky at all. His wings have no feathers, they're like a bat's wings, and he's agitating them. That's where the wind comes from. And he sends out three winds, and they freeze all of this lower part of hell. So in a way, he is the cause of the punishment of all of the souls in Cocytus. He is the one that froze the lake that they're stuck in. He wept out of 6 eyes. This gets more and more bizarre. Why is he weeping? Well, for one thing, you can be sure he's not weeping because of remorse, right? There's no place for repentance in hell. He's weeping because of frustration or because of rage, but it can't be contrition, right? These are not tears of contrition. He wept out of 6 eyes and down 3 chins. Tears gushed together with the bloody froth. Now again, bloody froth. Well, what's that? Is he gnashing his teeth and, has he injured his mouth in some way? No, we find out. He's chewing people, right? Within each mouth, he used it like a grinder. With gnashing teeth, he tore to bits a sinner, so that he brought much pain to 3 at once. I think you could do something by just going through one of these cantos and seeing how Dante continually creates little puzzles for the reader. And another puzzle, and another puzzle, and another puzzle, and another puzzle. That's what keeps you reading. Read Forster on the Art of the Novel. He talks about how the novel works by creating suspense. The reader wants to know the solution to a question. And so here we've got another question. First we have a question of, what's this bloody froth? And then we find out within each mouth, he used it like a grinder, he tore to bits a sinner, so that he brought much pain to 3 at once. And the reader thinks, wow, who are these going to be? Because in Dante's opinion, these must be the 3 worst people that ever lived. They're being punished directly by Satan himself. And so, of course, now he gives us the answer. The forward sinner found that biting nothing when matched against the clawing, for at times his back was stripped completely of its hide. So now we wonder, what is this? How could there be a difference in, one's being clawed? Who is that? Why is he being clawed? How is he being clawed? The soul up there who has to suffer most, my master said, Judas Iscariot. His head inside, he jerks his legs without. So, for Dante's point of view, the worst sinner in the history of the world was Judas, who betrayed Christ. That's not surprising. And he's being punished more because he's got his head in Satan's mouth. The other two, we find out, just have their legs. Of those two others, with their heads beneath, the one who hangs from the black snout is Brutus. Now, why black? I'm sure if you looked in the commentaries, you'd find some reasons. Brutus was one of the assassins of Caesar. See how he rides and does not say a word. That even comes through in Shakespeare's play of Julius Caesar, that Brutus was the more noble of the two conspirators, Brutus and Cassius. That other, who seems so robust, is Cassius. So there are three sinners who are punished as the worst sinners in the history of the world. One, the betrayer of Christ, who attempted to destroy the church. The other, the betrayers of the empire. So again, we see Dante, the popes argued that the pope was like the sun and the empire was like the moon. The empire only was able to have power or influence because it got the light of the sun. Dante says, no, the proper analogy is two suns, each with their own power and influence. And so here, the worst sinners, it's not just Judas, the betrayer of Christ, it's also Brutus and Cassius, betrayers of the empire. But Dante makes a slight distinction. Judas is punished more severely because he was the betrayer of Christ himself. Remember, this is still Virgil speaking. But night has come again, and it is time for us to leave. We have seen everything. Well, it's like one of those exhausting bus tours. Finally, we've seen everything. Now we can leave. We can go home. We can rest. Just as he asked, I clasped him round the neck, and he watched for the chance of time and place. And when the wings were open wide enough, he took fast hold upon the shaggy flanks, and then descended down from tuft to tuft, between the tangled hair and icy crusts. So, a really inspired idea, they're actually going to climb out of hell by climbing on Satan's body. But again, you have to remember, it's not a body that moves except the wings, and it's huge. It's more like a building than it is a living creature. When we had reached the point at which the thigh revolves, just at the swelling of the hip, my guide, with heavy strain and rugged work, reversed his head to where his legs had been, and grappled on the hair as one who climbs. I thought that we were going back to hell. Hold tight, my master said. He panted like a man exhausted. It is by such stairs that we must take our leave of so much evil. Well, this has got to be one of the greatest scenes in the entire poem. Maybe we can go back and just look at the PowerPoint for a second, and then we'll finish off looking at the text. First point, not anything like Milton's Satan. Remember, this is how Milton describes his Satan. His form had not yet lost all her original brightness, nor appeared less than an archangel ruined and the excessive glory obscured. So Milton's Satan retains a lot of the original majesty of the archangel that Lucifer was before he rebelled against God. Dante, rather, has Satan emphasize the ugliness and the stupidity of evil. He can do this, of course, because the allure of evil, which we get in those great scenes of Paradise Lost in which Satan tempts Eve, the allure of evil has already been illustrated by such characters as Francesca and Farinata and Ulysses. In other words, we've seen, Dante has demonstrated to us how evil can seem powerful and eloquent and beautiful. And Satan, therefore, doesn't need to show us that aspect of evil. He is simply described like a machine, like a windmill, one of those ceiling fans which thank heavens, aren't found that much anymore in Western houses. Now, a ceiling fan in a Chinese room is not a problem at all because the ceilings are so high. But in a normal Western suburban home, the ceilings are only 8 feet, which is about a foot and a half above my head. And then you put a ceiling fan up there. I hated those things, It felt like they were after me, But it was very popular before the common use of air conditioning, just to give some wind in the house. About 1970, everybody was buying those ceiling fans. So he's like a big ceiling fan, causing this wind, sending out this wind. And he's also like a grinder, just inflicting pain with his 3 mouths on his 3 chief, if you want to think of them as disciples, his followers. Dante the Pilgrim, having been through hell, now sees ultimate evil. Satan doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to say anything. And it also enforces the parallel with God in Paradiso, who doesn't speak either. And really, anything that they could say would be anticlimactic. I mean, even Dante couldn't think of anything for Satan to say. He certainly couldn't think of anything for God to say. And so they're both silent. God as the symbol of ultimate goodness, Satan as the symbol of ultimate evil. As with all of the souls of the Inferno, Satan has brought about his own punishment. Aspiring to be higher than an angel, not being content with being an angel, he has fallen to a level below that of the animals, forever deprived of even the ability to move around. And there's a Roman proverb, corruptio optimi, pessima. Corruption of the best is the worst of all. So this seems to explain Satan's situation. By turning away from God, he's imprisoned himself, forever fixed in the ice, which the beating of his own wings has frozen. So in a sense, he's punishing himself, because as he beats his wing, he just freezes the ice more and more solidly and imprisons himself in the center of the earth. So Dante's Satan is fundamentally stupid. Only the bare shreds of what he once was are left. He's a representative of negativity, and that's understandable if you think about what medieval philosophers defined evil as. Augustine and Aquinas and the other great theologians, evil is the absence of good. That is, that evil has no positive existence. Just like darkness, a physics professor would say darkness is the absence of light. Cold is the absence of heat. It's just an absence. It's nothing positive. And for this reason, as Satan is described by Dante, it's completely negative. He's completely negative. It's like the description that Mephisto gives in Faust. Ich bin der Geist, der stets verneint. I am the spirit who constantly denies. So Mephisto can do nothing unless there's something that he can reject, something that he can deny. Dante's Satan is the opposite of God. We talked about this, those opening lines, Vexilla regis prodeunt inferni, verso di noe. So the banners of the infernal king come towards us. This is the actual text of the first 4 verses of that hymn. The banners of the king come forth, the mystery of the cross shines, on which the creator of flesh was hung on the gallows, and so forth. And as I mentioned, this was a Easter Sunday morning hymn. The three-faced Satan rules from the bottom of his kingdom, just like God rules the world from heaven. He sends out a cold wind of hatred, just like God sends out the warmth and the light of his love, and he torments his followers, freezing them, gnawing them, clawing them, whereas, of course, God rewards his followers. So it's an absolute opposition between the two creatures, the two beings. Here is Doré's engraving, which I think is quite dramatic. Gives you a sense of the scale. Dante, and you can hardly see them, they're perched in a very picturesque place on that rock, looking down. Here's Casitas, here are the souls frozen in the ice, and there's this huge, angry creature, Satan, in the middle. The confrontation with Satan then is the climax of the first stage of Dante's journey. Each of the canticles, each of the volumes of the comedy ends with this kind of climactic meeting. The Inferno ends with Dante meeting Satan. The Purgatorio ends with Dante being reunited with Beatrice. And of course the Paradiso ends with Dante seeing God. This is the kind of diagram showing the next part of the journey, because of course now Dante and Virgil have reached the center of the earth, and they have to get out. And so what Dante imagines is that there's a river that has its source on the summit of the mountain of Purgatory, and this is the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And Dante goes through that river in order to forget about all of the bad things he's done in his life. And so even the bad memories are washed down through a channel on the opposite side of the earth from hell and back to Satan, and help to form the frozen water of Casitas. And so there's a kind of tunnel. And this is how Dante and Virgil are going to actually escape back to the surface of the earth. And where they come out is the exact opposite of Jerusalem, at the shores of the mountain of Purgatory. And then that's the next volume, is the climbing of the mountain of Purgatory. So it's quite a magnificent conception. Notice I put the South Pole in there, because I taught the class for years without realizing most of the students thought that Mount Purgatory was at the South Pole. But no, it's not at the South Pole. It's on the opposite side of the earth from Jerusalem. But the South Pole, I don't know, is somewhere like this. And the mountain of Purgatory, it's opposite Jerusalem, but it's not the South Pole. So this is the passage that we just described, which I think is quite beautifully realized. Poor Dante, when we had reached the point at which the thighs revolve just at the swelling of the hip. It's exactly the center of gravity of a human or any kind of humanoid creature's body. Just when we had reached the swelling of the hip, my guide with heavy strain and rugged work reversed his head to where his legs had been and grappled on the hair as one who climbs. I thought that we were going back to hell. Hold tight, my master said. He panted like a man exhausted. It is by such stairs we must take our leave of so much evil. So if with the magic of PowerPoint, you can do that, which is exactly what happens as soon as Dante passes through the center of the Earth's gravity. What used to be up becomes down, and what used to be down becomes up. So here they are standing on the ice, looking at Satan, looking at his wings and his three heads. And then when they pass the center of gravity, all of a sudden they see his feet, and they're on the other side. And up has changed to down. Up has changed to down. Down has changed to up, and now they're in the southern hemisphere. Here's one of my favorite illuminators, Giovanni di Paolo, 15th century. And it shows, like a cartoon, it shows here Virgil and Dante looking at Satan, and then they're beginning to climb on Satan, and then they see his legs, and then the final sort of panel of the cartoon, although there are no lines to show the panel, shows Dante and Virgil crawling out into this space. Into this space here. But You know, I showed that to my students for at least 3 years before I ever really looked at it closely. And the thing that's really, really interesting is that this is the black snout, right? This is the yellow snout. This is Judas who's being chewed with just his legs out. This is Cassius and this is Brutus. And Brutus, if you look carefully, is punching Virgil in the face. Why? Because Brutus was a Republican. And Virgil was the poet of the Roman Empire, right? So I think it's got to be that reason. But it never occurred to me. I never really looked at it that closely. But look, like that, and poor Virgil. You know, so there's a sort of joke in the illumination of I mean, this is obviously not in Dante, but what an interesting idea, you know, that the celebrator of the Roman Empire being punched by Brutus, who was, you know, one of the more noble of the champions of the Republic. That's why, of course, Brutus and Cassius killed Caesar. They didn't want him to become an absolute ruler. Okay, so go back to the text now. Then he slept through a crevice in a rock and placed me on the edge of it to sit. That done, he climbed towards me with steady steps. I raised my eyes, believing I should see the half of Lucifer that I had left. In other words, he thinks he's back up where he was before. Instead, I saw him with his legs turned up. And if I then became perplexed, do let the ignorant be judges, those who cannot understand what point I had just crossed. So Dante sort of rubs it in, you know, if you're thinking, you can figure out. But remember, you know, that scientific knowledge was not that common in Dante's day. And, you know, the center of gravity of the earth, no one, you know, had ever experienced anything like this. You really have to use your scientific imagination to understand what's happened here. Get up, my master said, be on your feet. The way is long, the path is difficult. The sun's already back to middle terce. So instead of being 7:30 at night, it's now 7:30 a.m. And again, something that we're used to, you know, if you fly to the U.S. or back to China, you pass the date line and, you know, you get jet lagged. And Dante has just picked up 12 hours, right? Because he's on the other side of the earth. He's in a different time zone now. It was no palace hall, the place in which we found ourselves, but with its rough-hewn floor and scanty light, a dungeon built by nature. So he's describing now this little sphere, he calls it later, which is the other face, the opposite side from Casidas or Judea. Before I free myself from this abyss, master, I said when I had stood up straight, tell me enough to see I don't mistake. Where is the ice? And how is he so placed head downward? Tell me too, how has the sun in so few hours gone from night to morning? And he to me, you still believe you are north of the center, where I grasp the hair of that damned worm who pierces through the world. And you were there so long as I descended. But when I turned, that's when you passed the point to which from every part all weights are drawn. And now you stand beneath the hemisphere, opposing that which cloaks the great dry lands, and underneath whose zenith, highest point, died the man whose birth and life were sinless in the world. Your feet are planted upon a little sphere that forms the other side of the Judeca. The Judeca is the lowest part of Casidas, where betrayers of their benefactors are found. So it seems to me to be a masterly fusion of literal adventure story and moral allegory here. By a very satisfying irony, Satan, for all of his attempt at evil, actually becomes the pathway, physically, the pathway to good, as Dante climbs down his hairy body in order to return to God. And Virgil enforces the moral. It is by such stairs that we must take our leave of so much evil. So it's a very old theological idea that evil cannot bring about lasting evil. It can only bring about greater good, right? So, again, because I teach these texts in the two similar courses, Goethe's Mephisto says, I am a part of that force that continually intends to do evil and continually creates good. And so Dante uses Satan as the pathway to escape from hell, his very body. At the center of the earth, literally and symbolically, Dante reaches the pivot point of his long journey, the turning point. Both physically and psychologically, he turns his back on Satan, on his kingdom, on all the ugliness and unhappiness it represents. And having passed the center of gravity by crawling down the side of Satan himself, Dante the Pilgrim has confronted the embodiment of all evil and has overcome it. And from this point on, as he now begins to climb instead of descend, every step that he takes is leading him up towards God and away from evil. Back to the text. Here it is morning when it's evening there. So now Virgil explains the time difference. And he whose hair has served us as a ladder is still fixed, even as he was before. This was the side on which he fell from heaven. For fear of him, the land that once loomed here made of the sea a veil and rose into our hemisphere. So that's really strange too. I mean, look at the diagram, right? This is the hemisphere of land, and this is the hemisphere of water. He was right. 70% or 40% of the northern hemisphere is land. Still mostly water. 40% land. Southern hemisphere, 19%. So how did Dante know that? How did he know the northern hemisphere has a lot more, twice as much land as the southern hemisphere? No way. It was a lucky guess. But he's got an explanation for it. Because as Satan came plummeting down, having been defeated and expelled from heaven by God, as he came plummeting down at the earth, the land, in fear of him, all moved to the other side of the earth to get away from him. And that's why the northern hemisphere has more land than the southern hemisphere. What a beautiful, what a creative idea to explain the situation of the earth. But remember, in Dante's time, nobody had been to the southern hemisphere. No one in Europe had been to the southern hemisphere. So there was no way that he could have known that that was the actual case. This was the side on which he fell from heaven. For fear of him, the land that once loomed here made of the sea a veil and rose into our hemisphere. And that land which appears upon this side, perhaps to flee from him, left here this hollow space and hurried upward. Well, at this point, we don't quite figure out what he's talking about. But what he means is that the earth that was once in this little cavern where Dante and Virgil are now rushed up as Satan impaled himself like a huge, what do they call those things? I can't remember now. Bunker-busting missile. It comes into the earth, goes right to the center, and throws up some earth from this cavern. And where does that earth go? Well, that's what, according to Dante, forms the mountain of purgatory. So the cavern here that's thrown up becomes the mountain of purgatory. So poetically and theologically, it's extremely ingenious that Satan punishes himself and at the same time creates a pathway for human beings to return to God. The mountain, which will eventually, of course, when he did it, there were no human beings, so he didn't have to. It was planned for later use as the mountain of purgatory. So what incredible myth making Dante is doing here. None of this is in the Bible or any other theological writing. This is all Dante's imagination. below the limit of that cave, its farthest point from Beelzebub, a place that one cannot see. It is discovered by ear. There is a stream that flows along the hollow of a rock, eroded by winding waters, and the slope is easy. Now this is Dante again. Virgil has finished speaking. So he now describes this tunnel, which has been worn by a river coming down from the mountain of Purgatory. It's interesting that when Virgil describes the exit over at line 94, he says, "Get up. Be on your feet. The way is long, the path is difficult." And then when Dante describes the same path, he says, "The slope is easy." And if you're thinking, you can understand that because Virgil is moving away from his natural place, which is in limbo. And Dante is moving towards his natural place, which is with God. So for Dante, it's an easier climb than it is for Virgil. My guide and I came on that hidden road to make our way back into the bright world. And with no care for any rest, we climbed, he first, I following, until I saw through a round opening some of those things of beauty heaven bears. It was from there that we emerged to see once more the stars. So as I said before, the stars, that word is the word that ends each of the 3 volumes. And there's a manuscript illumination which I like a lot. It's even labeled, in case you have any trouble, Dante, Virgilio, and there are the stars, right? There's poor Dante crawling out, Virgil giving him a hand, and they're back finally to what we discover is the shore of the mountain of Purgatory, ready to begin their second stage of their journey. Thomas Hardy, if there be a way to the better, it exacts a full look at the worst. That's maybe one of the justifications for reading the Inferno. You have to see what is worst before you can see something that's better. This is something I like too from Thomas Bergen's book on Dante. Dante has seen 128 sinners, specifically mentioned by name. He's had conversations with 37 of them. He's met 30 monsters and 5 hybrid creatures. He's had 2 boat rides. He's ridden a centaur and a winged, actually that's a mistake, dragon. He has twice fainted. He's been exposed to excessive heat, bitter cold, strong winds, fearful sights, terrifying sounds, and foul odors. He has felt compassion, pity, scorn, resentment, anger, vindictiveness, courage, and even once in a while a touch of amusement. All of these emotions are superimposed on the constants of terror, wonder, and lively curiosity.